January 24, 1915, the German armoured cruiser SMS Blücher listed heavily to port. Black smoke poured from her funnels, mixing with white steam from ruptured pipes that hissed and screamed across her dying deck. British shells had torn through her armour in multiple places. Her speed had fallen from 25 knots at the battle's start to 8 knots now. Behind her, disappearing into the winter mist, the rest of Konteradmiral Franz von Hipper's scouting force Seydlitz, Moltke, Dörflinger raced southeast toward German waters at 24 knots. They were escaping. On the bridge of HMS Lion, Vice-Admiral David Beatty watched through his binoculars as his quarry slipped away. His flagship, the most powerful battlecruiser in the Royal Navy, had taken heavy damage. Water flooded her feed tanks. Her port engine had stopped. The ship that had led the chase at 27 knots now struggled to maintain 8. The rest of his battlecruiser squadron Tiger, Princess Royal, New Zealand, indomitable, continued the pursuit. But they were concentrating their fire on Blücher. Only on Blücher. The dying, doomed, irrelevant Blücher. Not on the 3 German battlecruisers disappearing over the horizon. At 11:02, 7 minutes earlier, Lion's signals officer, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Seymour, had hoisted 2 flag signals simultaneously on Lion's halyards. Course northeast and engage the enemy's rear, 2 separate orders flying together on the same mast. A combination that would transform certain victory into partial success. 3 modern German battlecruisers that should have been destroyed would survive to fight another day at Jutland, 16 months later, where they would help inflict the heaviest losses the Royal Navy had suffered in over a century. The space between what Admiral Beatty intended and what his captains understood measured exactly 3 enemy battlecruisers wide. The trap had been perfect. At 2:30 on the morning of January 24, 1915, the duty officer at the Admiralty in London received an urgent message from Room 40, the secret cryptographic section that had been reading German naval codes since the war's early months. The message was brief but electric. German battlecruisers would sortie at dawn to raid British fishing vessels and patrol forces near the Dogger Bank. Room 40 had achieved what every admiral dreams of: complete knowledge of enemy intentions. They knew the German force composition. 4 capital ships. They knew the departure time, 5:45 a.m. from the Jade Estuary. They knew the destination, the Dogger Bank fishing grounds. They knew the mission: destroy British trawlers and any light forces encountered. What the Germans did not know was that their every signal was being read in London within hours of transmission. 3 months earlier, the Russians had recovered German naval codebooks from the wreck of the cruiser Magdeburg in the Baltic. They had secretly passed these to the British. Combined with other captured materials, Room 40 could decrypt most German naval communications. At 5:45 on the morning of January 24, the British battlecruiser squadron raised steam at Rosyth, their base in the Firth of Forth. Vice-Admiral David Beatty commanded the force. At 43, Beatty was the youngest admiral in the Royal Navy since Nelson. He had earned rapid promotion through a combination of aggressive leadership, personal courage, and powerful connections. He had married Ethel Tree, American heiress to the Marshall Field fortune. His wealth allowed him to maintain a lifestyle that matched his position as commander of the Navy's most glamorous force. Beatty's squadron represented the striking arm of the Grand Fleet, while Admiral John Jellicoe's battleships provided the Navy's ultimate strength. They were too slow and too valuable to chase German raiders. That task fell to the battlecruiser's ships that combined the firepower of a battleship with the speed of a cruiser. They sacrificed armor for velocity, trading protection for pursuit. 5 battlecruisers sortied from Rosyth that morning. HMS Lion led the line. Beatty's flagship displaced 26,270 tons. Her 8 13.5-inch guns could fire a 1,400-pound shell to 24,000 yards. She could make 27 knots in ideal conditions, though maintaining that speed consumed coal at a prodigious rate, nearly 800 tons per day. Her armor belt, 9 inches at its thickest, could resist enemy shells at longer ranges, but became vulnerable as distances closed. Behind Lion came Tiger, the newest addition to the fleet, commissioned only 3 months earlier. She mounted the same 13.5-inch guns as Lion but incorporated lessons learned from earlier designs. Her armor distribution was superior. Her fire control systems were the most advanced in the fleet. But her crew was green. They had not yet melded into the efficient machine that battle demanded. Third in line came Princess Royal, Lion's sister ship. Nearly identical in capability, she had been tested in the Heligoland Bight action 5 months earlier. Her captain, Osman Brock, was considered one of the finest ship handlers in the service. He understood both his vessel's capabilities and her limits. The 4th and 5th positions were filled by the older battlecruisers New Zealand and Indomitable. They mounted 12-inch guns instead of 13.5-inch. Their armor was thinner. Their top speed was a knot or 2 less. But they added weight to the British line. In a pursuit action, they could engage the enemy's rear while the newer ships pressed ahead. Supporting the battlecruisers were 7 light cruisers under Commodore William Goodenough. His flagship, HMS Southampton, led Birmingham, Nottingham, and Lowestoft. These ships served as the eyes of the fleet, scouting ahead and on the flanks. Their 6-inch guns could not penetrate capital ship armor, but they could drive off enemy destroyers and report enemy movements. 35 destroyers completed the Breit force. These small vessels, typically displacing less than 1,000 tons, served multiple roles. They screened against submarine attack. They could launch torpedo attacks of their own. They rescued survivors from damaged ships. In the pre-dawn darkness, they took station around the larger vessels like sheepdogs around a flock. The weather that morning was typical for the North Sea in January. The temperature stood at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind came from the north-northeast at force 3, raising a moderate sea. Visibility varied between 4 and 7 miles as banks of mist drifted across the grey water. Spray froze on the forward turrets and bridge windows. Ice had to be chipped from rangefinders and voice tubes. In the engine rooms of the British battlecruisers, the temperature told a different story. As the ships worked up to cruising speed, the stokers fed coal into voracious furnaces. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, then 110, then 120. Men worked 4-hour shifts, the maximum the human body could endure in such conditions. They shoveled coal from the bunkers to the furnaces in a rhythm as old as steam navigation. Each battlecruiser required nearly 200 stokers and trimmers to maintain high speed. The British force had every advantage. They knew where the Germans were going. They had superior numbers, 5 capital ships to 4. They were approaching from an unexpected direction. The Germans expected to find only trawlers and perhaps a few destroyers. Instead, they would encounter the concentrated striking power of the Royal Navy. But between strategic advantage and tactical execution lay the challenge of command and control. In 1915, admirals commanded fleets much as Nelson had through signal flags. Wireless existed but was unreliable and easily intercepted. Searchlights could be used for signaling but only at night and at limited range. In daylight battle, colored cloth rectangles hoisted on halyards remained the primary means of communication. The man responsible for translating Admiral Beatty's intentions into those cloth rectangles was Lieutenant Commander Ralph Seymour. At 32, Seymour had served as Beatty's flag lieutenant since 1913. He had followed Beatty from the 1st Battle Squadron to command of the battlecruiser force. The position of flag lieutenant was both prestigious and pressured. He served as the admiral's tactical voice, converting verbal orders into signal flags that the fleet would obey. Seymour came from a naval family. His father had been a captain. His older brother served in destroyers. Ralph himself had entered HMS Britannia as a cadet at 13, progressing steadily through the ranks. He had specialized in signals, mastering the complexity of the signal book, that Bible of naval communication that contained hundreds of flag combinations, each with specific meaning. The signal book appeared comprehensive. Signal 235 meant open fire. Signal 184 meant cease fire. Signal 24 meant alter course to starboard. Hundreds of combinations covered every conceivable tactical situation. In theory, no ambiguity existed. Every ship carried the same book. Every signal officer knew the meanings, but context mattered. A signal that seemed clear on a calm day in harbour could read differently in battle. Smoke obscured flags. Distance made colours indistinct. The angle from which one viewed the hoist could change interpretation. And under the stress of combat, with shells falling and seconds to decide, even experienced officers could misread or misunderstand. As Lyon led the British line southeast at 20 knots, Seymour had the signal flags prepared. The halyards were checked and free-running. The flag lockers were arranged in numerical order. His team of signalmen stood ready. They had drilled this countless times, but drill was not battle. In drill, no one died from a misunderstood signal. Meanwhile, 130 miles to the southeast, the German scouting force proceeded on what they believed was a routine operation. Konteradmiral Franz von Hipper commanded from SMS Seydlitz. At 51, Hipper was one of Germany's most aggressive naval commanders. He had led the raids on Scarborough and Hartlepool the previous month, bombarding British coastal towns to draw out portions of the Grand Fleet. Hipper's force consisted of 3 modern battlecruisers and 1 older armoured cruiser. Seydlitz, his flagship, displaced 24,988 tons. She mounted 10 11-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. Her armour, utilising the latest Krupp-cemented steel, was actually thicker than her British counterparts in crucial areas. She could make 26 knots, though her turbines were temperamental and required constant maintenance. SMS Moltke, the second ship, was Seydlitz's near sister. Slightly older, slightly slower, but equally well-armed and armoured. Her captain, Kapitän zur See von Levetzow, was considered one of the finest ship handlers in the Kaiserliche Marine. He had drilled his crew relentlessly since the war's outbreak. Third came Derfflinger, Germany's newest battlecruiser. Commissioned just 4 months earlier, she represented the latest in German naval design. Her 12-inch guns were more powerful than the 11-inch weapons of her consorts. Her armour scheme incorporated lessons learned from earlier battles. But like Tiger on the British side, her crew was still learning their ship. The weakness in Hipper's line was SMS Blücher. Technically, an armoured cruiser, not a battlecruiser, she had been included to add firepower against the light forces they expected to encounter. She displaced 15,842 tons, mounted 12 8.2-inch guns, and could make 25 knots when her machinery cooperated. Against destroyers or light cruisers, she was formidable. Against British battlecruisers, she was hideously vulnerable. The Germans had departed the Jade estuary at 5:45, exactly as Room 40 had predicted. They steamed at 15 knots, conserving coal for the return journey. 4 light cruisers scouted ahead: Groudens, Stralsund, Kolberg, and Rostock. 18 destroyers provided escort. The entire force stretched across 10 miles of ocean. As the morning progressed, neither force knew the exact position of the other, but the geometry of interception was set. The British approached from the northwest at increasing speed, 20 knots, then 22, then 24 as Beatty pressed forward. The Germans continued west at their leisurely 15 knots, unaware of the trap closing around them. At 7:15, the first indication of contact came not from the warships, but from a humble fishing vessel. The British trawler Gem, working the Dogger Bank grounds, signalled that she had sighted smoke to the southeast. Large vessels, moving west. The message was relayed through the patrol forces to Beatty's flagship. Beatty immediately ordered an increase to 25 knots. The battlecruisers surged forward. Black smoke poured from their funnels as stokers fed more coal to the furnaces. The deck plates vibrated under the strain of maximum revolutions. In the engine rooms, artificers watched pressure gauges nervously. One mechanical failure now would mean missing the action. At 7:30, the sun began to rise, painting the eastern horizon in shades of grey and gold. Visibility remained variable 5 miles, then 7, then 4 as mist banks drifted past. Ice continued to form on exposed surfaces. Gun crews stamped their feet and blew on their hands, trying to maintain feeling in the bitter cold. Neither force had yet sighted the other directly, but both were aware something was developing. The Germans intercepted increased British wireless traffic, though they could not decrypt it. The British tracked German signals, reading every transmission through their captured codebooks. Each side was feeling for the other through the electronic spectrum, like boxers testing distance before the first punch. At 7:50, the tension broke. HMS Aurora, scouting on the British left flank, signaled, "Enemy in sight." The first shells fell into the North Sea at 8:50, 2 on the morning of January 24, 1915. HMS Lion, leading the British line, opened fire on SMS Blücher at 20,000 yards 11.5 statute miles. At this range, the shells flew for 33 seconds before impact. During that time, the target travelled nearly 300 yards. The gunners had to estimate not where the enemy was, but where he would be. The opening salvo fell short by 500 yards, raising tall white columns in the grey sea. Lion's gunnery officer, watching through his rangefinder, called corrections. The second salvo was closer, only 200 yards short. The third straddled 1 shell short, 1 over. They had the range. But before Lion could fire again, the Germans replied. At 9:11, SMS Seydlitz opened fire on Lion. The first German salvo was remarkably accurate, falling only 100 yards short. Konteradmiral Hipper, watching from Seydlitz's bridge, permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. His ships might be outnumbered, but German gunnery was second to none. The battle developed into a running fight. The Germans fled southeast at 20 knots. Hipper had finally abandoned the pretense of searching for trawlers and ordered maximum sustainable speed. But this was still limited by Blücher, whose machinery could not maintain more than 20 knots for extended periods without risk of breakdown. The British pursued at 25 knots, slowly but inexorably closing the range. The mathematics of the pursuit were simple but crucial. At a 5-knot speed advantage, the British would close 100 yards every minute. Starting from 20,000 yards, they would reach decisive range under 15,000 yards in 50 minutes. But mathematics assumed perfect conditions. In reality, ships maneuvered to avoid shells. Smoke obscured targets. Mechanical problems developed under the strain of maximum speed. At 9:05, HMS Tiger joined the action. Her gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Pelly, had misunderstood the fire distribution. British doctrine called for each ship to engage its opposite number, first versus first, second versus second. This would ensure no enemy vessel went unengaged. But Tiger fired at Seydlitz, who Lion was already engaging. This left Moltke, the second German ship, free to fire without distraction. The error stemmed from multiple factors. Smoke from Lion partially obscured the German line. The Germans were not in perfect line-ahead formation due to Blücher's speed limitations, and a signal from Lion ordering engage corresponding ships had arrived just as Tiger was opening fire, creating confusion about whether to continue the current target or shift. For nearly 15 minutes, Moltke enjoyed the luxury of undisturbed gunnery practice. Her salvos walked steadily closer to Lion. At 9:20, she scored her first hit. An 11-inch shell struck Lion's forecastle, exploding against the 9-inch armor. The armor held, but the shock was tremendous. Men were thrown to the deck. Voice tubes ruptured. Splinters of steel whistled across the bridge, wounding 2 lookouts. At 9:22, Moltke hit again. This shell struck below the waterline, penetrating into a coal bunker. Water began flooding in. Damage control parties rushed to the scene, working in near darkness as emergency lighting flickered. They shored up bulkheads with timber, stuffed mattresses into holes, and fought to contain the flooding. But water continued to seep through strained seams. Meanwhile, the British fire was beginning to tell. At 9:28, Lion scored a critical hit on Seydlitz. A 13.5-inch shell penetrated the barbette of the after-superfiring turret. The explosion ignited propellant charges. Flames shot 200 feet into the air, a pillar of fire visible to both fleets. Only the heroic action of the turret crew, flooding the magazine before the fire could spread, saved the ship from catastrophic explosion. But the damage was severe. Both guns in the turret were disabled. 70 men died instantly. The turret training mechanism was wrecked. More critically, the hit revealed a fundamental flaw in German ammunition handling. Flash from the explosion had traveled down the ammunition hoist toward the magazine. Only quick flooding had prevented total destruction. Princess Royal, third in the British line, was correctly engaging Derfflinger. The two ships traded salvos at 17,000 yards. Princess Royal's Captain Brock was known for his methodical approach to gunnery. Rather than rapid fire, he preferred deliberate, carefully aimed salvos. His patience paid off at 9:35 when a 13.5-inch shell struck Derfflinger's forward turret, jamming it in train. New Zealand and Indomitable, the two older British battlecruisers, concentrated their fire on Blücher. The German armoured cruiser was suffering terribly. Her thinner armour could not withstand 12-inch shells at these ranges. By 9:40, she had taken multiple hits. Her forward turret was disabled. Fires burned in her superstructure. Her speed began to fall first to 18 knots, then 16. The disparity in firepower was becoming evident. The British were firing 13.5-inch and 12-inch shells, weighing up to 1,400 pounds. The Germans replied with 11-inch and 12-inch shells weighing 850 to 900 pounds. Each British hit caused proportionally more damage. But the Germans had advantages too: superior optical rangefinders, better armour-piercing shells, and crews trained to a razor's edge of efficiency. At 9:43, disaster nearly struck the British. A 12-inch shell from Derfflinger penetrated Tiger's forward turret. The explosion killed everyone in the gunhouse. Flames spread down toward the handling rooms. But Tiger had learned from studying earlier battles. Flash-tight doors had been installed and were properly closed. The fire was contained, though the turret was out of action for the remainder of the battle. By 9:50, patterns were emerging in the battle. Lion, despite taking multiple hits, continued to lead and fight. Her salvos were regular and increasingly accurate. Tiger, with one turret disabled and still firing at the wrong target, was contributing less than her power suggested. Princess Royal was fighting a skillful duel with Derfflinger. New Zealand and Indomitable were systematically destroying Blücher. On the German side, Seydlitz was seriously damaged but maintaining speed. Moltke was largely untouched and fighting effectively. Derfflinger had lost one turret but remained dangerous. Blücher was falling progressively further behind, her situation growing desperate. At 9:52, Hipper made a crucial decision. He ordered his 3 battlecruisers to turn 2 points to starboard toward the British. This would close the range but might allow Blücher to escape in the confusion. It was a calculated risk. German ships would face increased British fire, but they might damage the British enough to force them to break off pursuit. The turn lasted only 3 minutes before Hipper resumed the southeastern course, but it had multiple effects. The range dropped rapidly to 15,000 yards. The British had to adjust their fire control solutions. Some ships lost their targets in the smoke and confusion of the turn, and critically, it brought Lion into easier range of the German guns. At 10:01, Moltke scored a devastating hit on Lion. An 11-inch shell penetrated the armour belt below the waterline. The explosion opened a hole 6 feet across. Water poured in at hundreds of tons per minute. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the flooding, but the ship began to list. At 10:10, another German shell struck Lion's engine room ventilators. Smoke and flames were sucked down into the machinery spaces. Engineers worked in temperatures exceeding 130 degrees, struggling to maintain steam pressure as smoke filled their compartments. Several men collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to be dragged to safety. The accumulation of damage was taking its toll on Lion. Her speed fell to 24 knots, then 22. She began to fall behind Tiger. Beatty realized his flagship might not be able to maintain the pursuit much longer. He needed to issue clear orders while he still could. At 10:18, the critical hit came. A 12-inch shell from Derfflinger struck Lion's port feed tank. The explosion was not particularly large, but its effects were catastrophic. Salt water contaminated the feed system for the port engines. Within minutes, salt deposits began forming in the boilers. Steam pressure dropped. The port turbines began to slow. Chief Engineer Alexander Grant reported to the bridge. "Port engine failing, sir. Contaminated feed water. I can give you 8 knots, perhaps 10, no more." Beatty understood immediately. His flagship was crippled. She would fall out of line within minutes. The entire dynamics of the pursuit would change. He turned to his flag lieutenant. "Seymour," he said, "we must ensure the squadron continues after the enemy's main force. Blücher is finished, she doesn't matter. The battlecruisers are what count." Lieutenant Commander Ralph Seymour nodded. He understood the Admiral's intent, or thought he did. He moved to the signal halyards to convert Beatty's strategic vision into tactical commands. The next signals he hoisted would determine the battle's outcome. At 10:45, HMS Lion was dying as a fighting unit. Water poured through multiple shell holes below the waterline. The port engine had stopped completely. The starboard engine, straining to maintain headway alone, could produce only 8 knots. The flagship's list had increased to 11 degrees. On the bridge, the inclinometer showed the deck tilting further with each minute as flooding continued. Vice-Admiral Beatty stood at the bridge wing, watching his squadron pull ahead. Tiger was now 800 yards ahead and increasing the distance. Princess Royal was barely visible through the smoke. New Zealand and Indomitable were hull down on the horizon. His fleet was leaving him behind. The tactical situation at that moment was complex but clear. 3 miles ahead, Blücher wallowed in a circle, burning from stem to stern. She could make perhaps 8 knots and was clearly finished as a fighting unit. 6 miles beyond her, Hipper's 3 battlecruisers, Seydlitz, Moltke, and Derfflinger, continued southeast at 24 knots. They were damaged but capable. Seydlitz streamed smoke from her after turret. Derfflinger had lost 1 turret, but they were escaping. Beatty called a brief conference with Captain Chatfield and Lieutenant Commander Seymour. The conversation, recorded in multiple post-battle reports, would become one of the most analyzed command discussions in naval history. "Chatfield, can we maintain station?" "No, sir. We're taking water faster than the pumps can handle. 8 knots maximum, and that not for long." "Seymour, can we transfer flag?" "Not under these conditions, sir. No destroyer could come alongside, and the range is opening too quickly for boat transfer." Beatty nodded. He had minutes, perhaps less, to issue orders that would determine whether 3 German battlecruisers escaped or were destroyed. He looked at the tactical plot. The geometry was still favorable. If his 4 operational battlecruisers ignored Blücher and continued southeast, they could catch Hipper before he reached the safety of German minefields. "Signal the squadron," Beatty said. "They are to continue the pursuit of the main enemy force. Leave Blücher, she's finished. Get after the battlecruisers." Seymour moved to execute the order. But here, at the critical moment, the complexity of naval signaling in 1915 intervened. There was no single signal in the book that said, "Ignore the crippled ship and pursue the main force." Seymour had to construct the Admiral's intent from available signals. He could have hoisted "General Chase," but that was traditionally used at a battle's start, not middle. He could have signaled "Pursue the flying enemy," but that might seem to include Blücher, who was certainly flying if not fleeing. He could have used ship names, "Engage, Seydlitz, Moltke, Derfflinger," but that required 3 separate hoists in sequence, taking precious time. At 11:02, Seymour made his choice. He ordered 2 signals hoisted simultaneously, "Course northeast" and "Engage the enemy's rear." From Seymour's perspective on Lyon's Bridge, the signals seemed clear. The German battlecruisers bore northeast. "Course northeast" would point the squadron toward them. "Engage the enemy's rear" would clarify that they should engage the rear ship of that formation Derfflinger, not the separated Blücher. But from Tiger's Bridge, 1,000 yards ahead, and viewing the signals through smoke and spray, the interpretation was different. Course northeast did indeed point toward Blücher, who lay in that direction. Engage the enemy's rear seemed to confirm this Blücher was certainly the rearmost enemy ship visible. The two signals together appeared to order an attack on Blücher. Rear Admiral Archibald Moore, commanding the squadron from HMS New Zealand, faced an immediate decision. Lion was clearly crippled and falling behind. These might be Beatty's last coherent signals. Should he interpret them literally or try to divine Beatty's actual intent? Moore was 55 years old, a careful officer who had risen through attention to detail rather than brilliance. He had never commanded in a major action. His instinct was to follow orders precisely as given. The signals said northeast and enemy's rear. Blücher lay northeast. Blücher was the enemy's rear. The logic seemed inescapable. At 11:05, Moore ordered the squadron to alter course toward Blücher. Tiger turned first, her wake carving a white arc in the grey sea. Princess Royal followed, then New Zealand, then Indomitable. 4 powerful battlecruisers, capable of 25 knots, sustained speed, mounting between them 32 heavy guns, turned away from 3 fleeing enemy battlecruisers to concentrate on 1 dying armoured cruiser. On Lyon's Bridge, Beatty watched in disbelief. His ships were turning the wrong way. They were abandoning the pursuit. He ordered Seymour to signal, "Resume chase of enemy battlecruisers." But Lion had fallen so far behind that the flags were illegible through the smoke. He tried, "Engage the flying enemy," but got no acknowledgement. The flagship was now nearly 2 miles behind Tiger and falling further back each minute. At 11:09, Beatty attempted wireless. But Lion's main wireless had been destroyed by shell fire at 10:30. The emergency set had limited range and was subject to massive interference from electrical damage throughout the ship. The message went out, but was never acknowledged. By 11:15, the 4 British battlecruisers had formed a rough line around the dying Blücher. They fired deliberately, methodically. At 6,000 yards, every salvo hit. The German cruiser's remaining turrets were silenced one by one. Fires spread throughout her hull. Her list increased to 40 degrees. Meanwhile, 5 miles to the southeast, Hipper's battlecruisers disappeared into the mist. Their smoke grew fainter. The sound of their guns, which had thundered across the water for 2 hours, faded to silence. They had escaped. On different bridges across the British squadron, different officers reached different conclusions about what had happened. Captain Henry Pelly of Tiger would later testify. The signals were clear. Course northeast pointed to Blücher. Attack the enemy's rear confirmed it. With Lion falling behind, we followed the last clear order. Captain Osmond Brock of Princess Royal wrote in his action report, 2 interpretations seemed possible. But with the flagship disabled and Admiral Moore ordering the turn toward Blücher, I conformed to the squadron's movement. Captain Lionel Halsey of New Zealand privately believed they should have continued after the battlecruisers but followed Moore's lead. In battle, unity of action supersedes individual interpretation. Rear Admiral Moore himself would defend his decision for the rest of his life. The signals admitted only one interpretation when read together. Course northeast and enemy's rear meant Blücher. To assume otherwise would have been to disregard direct orders. And Lieutenant Commander Seymour, in testimony that would haunt him, admitted, "I believed the context would make the meaning clear. The enemy's main force was escaping. Surely that was the priority. I did not consider that the signals might be read differently." The 10 minutes between 11:02 and 11:12 determined the battle's outcome. In those 10 minutes, 3 German battlecruisers moved beyond effective gun range. They would require over an hour to catch now, and they were less than 3 hours from safety. The pursuit was effectively over, though no one would admit it yet. At 11:20, Commodore Goodenough's light cruisers appeared from the north. They had driven off the German destroyer threat and were seeking to rejoin the battle. Goodenough could see Hipper's battlecruisers in the distance, and the British battlecruisers pounding Blücher. He signaled more. Enemy battlecruisers bearing 135 degrees, 16,000 yards, opening. Request permission to engage. Moore's response: complete destruction of enemy rear ship. Maintain station. Goodenough was appalled. 3 enemy capital ships were escaping while 4 British battlecruisers pounded 1 dying cruiser. He signaled again. Enemy battlecruisers will escape unless engaged immediately. Moore: negative. Complete current action. Goodenough considered disobeying. His 4 light cruisers could not stop 3 battlecruisers, but they could shadow them, report their position, perhaps slow them with destroyer attacks. But Moore was the senior officer present. To disobey would risk court-martial. Goodenough held some station and watched the Germans escape. At 11:32, SMS Blücher finally capsized. She rolled to port with majestic slowness, men sliding down her side as it became horizontal, some walking on her hull as she turned turtle. Her funnels struck the water, sending up geysers of steam. Then her turrets touched the surface, and their weight pulled her under. She vanished at position 54 degrees 28 north, 5 degrees 25 east, taking 792 men with her. British destroyers moved in to rescue survivors. They pulled 234 German sailors from the oil-covered water, many suffering from hypothermia in the 34-degree sea. Among them was Korvettenkapitän Wolf, Blücher's gunnery officer, who would provide valuable intelligence about German procedures and the battle from their perspective. At 11:45, with Blücher gone, Rear Admiral Moore finally turned his attention to the escaped battlecruisers. He ordered, "General chase, course 140 degrees." But it was far too late. Hipper had a 13-mile head start. The geometry was now impossible. To catch the Germans before they reached protective minefields would require a stern chase of 4 hours at a 1-knot speed advantage. They had less than 3 hours before the Germans reached safety. On Lion, now 8 miles behind the action, Beatty watched his squadron disappear to the southeast. His flagship was making bare steerage way, circling slowly to port as her damaged steering failed to respond. Water was now flooding the middle engine room. Captain Chatfield reported that Lion might not survive the return journey. At 11:50, Beatty made his final signal of the battle. Using the destroyer attack as a messenger, he ordered Moore to abandon the chase and form a protective screen around Lion for the withdrawal. The Battle of Doggerbank was over. The North Sea at noon on January 24, 1915, presented a scene of controlled chaos. HMS Lion, the pride of the Royal Navy's battlecruiser force, wallowed in the slight swell, barely making way. Her port list had increased to 13 degrees. Smoke poured from ventilators where fires still burned in her lower compartments. Oil leaked from ruptured fuel tanks, spreading an iridescent slick across the grey water. The destroyer attack had closed to take her under tow, but Lion's weight over 26,000 tons even damaged would limit speed to 4 knots. 2 miles to the southeast, the oil slick from SMS Blücher's grave marked where 792 German sailors had gone down with their ship. British destroyers crisscrossed the area, searching for additional survivors. The rescued Germans, wrapped in blankets and suffering from hypothermia, huddled on the destroyer's decks. Many were burned. Others showed symptoms of chlorine gas poisoning from ruptured batteries mixing with seawater. The main British battlecruiser squadron had reformed into line ahead, following Moore's order to abandon pursuit. They showed the marks of battle. Tiger had a gaping hole in her forward turret where German shells had found their mark. Princess Royal's funnels were holed, reducing her draft and limiting speed. New Zealand had fires burning in her coal bunkers that would take hours to extinguish. Indomitable, least damaged, had still taken splinter damage that killed 2 men and wounded 7. 5 miles further southeast, just visible through the mist, the smoke of Hipper's escaping squadron could still be seen. Seydlitz, Moltke, and Derfflinger had survived what should have been their destruction. They were damaged sidelets particularly, with her after turret destroyed and fires still burning, but they were afloat, capable, and heading home. At 12:15 p.m., an incident occurred that would add controversy to an already contentious battle. British submarines E-11 and E-16, pre-positioned at the Dogger Bank, finally reached attack positions. E-11 fired 2 torpedoes at what her captain believed was a German battlecruiser. Both missed. The target was actually HMS Southampton, Goodenough's flagship. The near miss caused panic firing from several British destroyers, who reported submarine contacts in multiple directions. Moore, already concerned about submarine threats, ordered immediate evasive action. The British squadron scattered, turning away from the perceived threat. By the time the confusion was sorted out, the submarines were British, the targets were British, no German U-boats were present. Another 20 minutes had been lost. Hipper's force was now beyond any possibility of interception. The journey home began at 12:30 p.m. HMS Indomitable took Lion under tow, a complex evolution requiring careful seamanship. The tow cable, 6 inches thick and weighing several tons, had to be passed in moderate seas while both ships maintained way. It took 40 minutes to secure the tow. Once connected, the best speed they could make was 4 knots walking pace. The British squadron formed a protective screen around the crippled flagship. Destroyers took station in an anti-submarine screen, though fuel considerations meant they could not maintain high-speed zigzag patterns. The light cruisers spread out ahead and on the flanks. The operational battlecruisers formed a rough square around Lion, ready to engage any German force that might attempt to finish her off. Beatty spent the return journey in his sea cabin, drafting his action report. The document, which would be analysed and debated for decades, was remarkably restrained. He noted the hits on Lion, the mechanical failures, the signal difficulties. He did not directly criticise Moore or Seymour. His most pointed comment was indirect. The enemy's main force was allowed to escape while his lame duck was destroyed. In Tiger's wardroom, officers discussed what had gone wrong. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Pelly, defended his target selection. In the smoke and confusion, Seydlitz seemed the obvious target. The signal to engage corresponding ships came after we'd opened fire. The navigator disagreed. We should have been watching Moltke from the start. She was our natural opponent. On New Zealand, Rear Admiral Moore was already preparing his defence. He had followed the signals as received. He had destroyed an enemy warship. He had preserved the squadron when submarine threats appeared. If the Admiralty wanted different results, they should provide clearer orders and better communication methods. The German squadron, meanwhile, was having its own difficulties. Seydlitz was in critical condition. The fire in her after turret had spread to adjoining compartments. Hundreds of tons of water had been pumped in to prevent magazine explosion. She was down by the stern, making only 18 knots. If the British had maintained pursuit for another hour, she might have been caught. Moltke had taken 4 hits below the waterline. Her pumps were managing the flooding, but barely. Derflinger's forward turret remained jammed, and she had lost 60 men killed and 90 wounded. The German squadron was victorious in the sense of escaping, but they had been roughly handled. At 2:30 p.m., Hipper's force passed the outer defensive line at Heligoland Bight. German destroyers and light cruisers sortied to provide escort. The Kaiser himself monitored reports from Berlin. When confirmation came that 3 of 4 capital ships had returned, he reportedly said, "The British had us and let us go. Beatty will not be pleased with his captains." The British force's return journey took 32 hours. Twice during the night of January 24 to 25, submarine alarms caused the squadron to scatter. No actual submarines were present, but the threat could not be ignored. Each alarm cost an hour as ships reformed and the tow was checked. During the long journey home, Lieutenant Commander Seymour had time to reflect on what had gone wrong. He reviewed the signal log obsessively. Every hoist was recorded with time and acknowledgement. Technically, he had done nothing wrong. The signals were valid, selections from the signal book, They had been properly hoisted and acknowledged, but between technical correctness and tactical effectiveness lay a chasm. He could have signaled, "Continue chase of enemy battlecruisers," a longer signal but unambiguous. He could have used ship names, Engage, Seydlitz, Moltke, Derfflinger in succession. He could have signaled, "Negative Blücher, continue pursuit," non-standard but clear. Instead, he had chosen signals that seemed clear to him in the context he understood, but read differently to others seeing them through smoke at a distance. The failure was not in the signal book or the flag system. It was in the assumption that context was universally understood, that intent was self-evident, that clarity existed where only ambiguity resided. At 4 p.m. on January 25, Lion finally entered the Firth of Forth under tow. She was listing 16 degrees and down by the bow. Water had flooded 7 compartments. Only superb damage control and calm seas had kept her afloat. She would require 4 months in dock for repairs. The other battlecruisers proceeded to their berths, where ammunition and coal were immediately loaded. Despite damage, they might be needed if the Germans attempted to exploit the British injury. Tiger had 37 dead to bury. Princess Royal had 21. The total British casualties were 15 dead and 80 wounded, remarkably light for a major action. But casualties in men did not reflect the true cost of the battle. 3 German battlecruisers that should have been destroyed had escaped. They would be repaired, reinforced, and fight again. At Jutland, 16 months later, Seydlitz, Moltke, and Derfflinger would form the core of Hipper's scouting force. They would help inflict over 6,000 casualties on the Royal Navy, including the destruction of 3 British battlecruisers. If they had been sunk at Dogger Bank, Jutland might have been the decisive victory the Royal Navy sought. Instead, it became an indecisive slaughter that left German naval power intact. The seeds of Jutland's disappointment were sown in the signals that flew from Lion's halyards at 11:02 on January 24, 1915. The Admiralty's first communiqué, released at 8 p.m. on January 24, claimed victory. Enemy forces engaged off Dogger Bank. SMS Blücher sunk. Enemy driven from the sea. British naval supremacy demonstrated. The British public, hungry for good news after months of stalemate on the Western Front, celebrated. The Times headline on January 25 read, "Running fight, running away, German squadron flees." But within the Admiralty, difficult questions were being asked. First Sea Lord Admiral John Fisher read Beatty's preliminary report at 4 a.m. on January 26. His reaction, recorded by his secretary, was volcanic. "My God, they had them in their hands and let them go. 3 battlecruisers for 1 armoured cruiser, a poor exchange." Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, was more circumspect. He recognized the political value of any victory, however incomplete, but he also understood the strategic implications. In a memorandum to the cabinet, he wrote, "While we have achieved a tactical success, we must examine why a strategic opportunity was missed. The German battlecruiser force remains intact and dangerous." The Court of Inquiry convened on February 2, 1915, aboard HMS Hercules at Rosyth. Rear Admiral Sir Stanley Colville presided, with 4 other senior officers forming the panel. The proceedings were classified, not to be released for 70 years. The court's charge was specific: determine what happened, why it happened, and whether any officer should face court-martial. Vice-Admiral Beatty testified first. His appearance was noted as composed, but showing signs of strain. He had spent the intervening week reviewing every decision, every signal, every moment of the battle. His testimony was measured. At approximately 11, it became apparent that Lion could no longer maintain position in the line. The port engine had failed due to contaminated feedwater. Speed was reduced to 8 knots. The tactical situation required immediate decision. 3 enemy battlecruisers were escaping while 1 armoured cruiser, already crippled, remained within range. My intention was clear: continue pursuit of the main enemy force while 1 ship finished the cripple. I communicated this to my flag lieutenant with orders to signal the squadron accordingly. When asked about the specific signals, Beatty was careful. The signals hoisted were from the approved signal book. The tactical situation seemed to me to make their meaning evident. The enemy's main force was escaping to the northeast. That was the priority. The court pressed, "Did you specifically approve the signals, course northeast, and engage the enemy's rear?" I instructed Lieutenant Commander Seymour to ensure the squadron pursued the main enemy force. The specific signals were his selection from the signal book. I had confidence in his ability to translate my intent into appropriate signals. This was crucial testimony. Beatty was protecting Seymour while not fully endorsing his actions. The Admiral took responsibility for the intent while leaving the execution to his subordinate. Rear Admiral Moore testified on February 3. His demeanor was recorded as defensive but confident. He presented his case methodically. At 11:02, I observed 2 signals from Lion, course northeast, and engage the enemy's rear. Lion was clearly disabled and falling behind. These might be the flagship's final signals. My duty was to obey them precisely. The course northeast pointed directly at Blücher. The enemy's rear was Blücher. She was the rearmost enemy vessel visible. The 2 signals taken together admitted only one interpretation: attack Blücher. The court asked, "Did you consider that the Admiral might have meant the rear of the main enemy force?" I considered multiple interpretations. But in battle, one must act on the most obvious meaning. To assume hidden meanings or complex interpretations while under fire would be to risk paralysis. I acted on what the signals plainly said. Would you have acted differently knowing Admiral Beatty's actual intent? Absolutely. If the signal had read, "Continue pursuit of enemy battlecruisers," or "Ignore Blücher, maintain chase," I would have acted accordingly. But those were not the signals received. Moore's defense was strong. He had followed the literal meaning of the signals. No court-martial could convict him for obeying orders as received. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Seymour testified on February 4. His appearance drew particular attention. At 32, he was young for such responsibility. The court record noted, "Officer appeared composed, but under evident strain. Spoke quietly, but clearly." Seymour explained the sequence of events. Admiral Beatty instructed me to ensure the squadron continued pursuing the main enemy force. Lion was taking water and losing speed. Time was critical. I needed to convey the Admiral's intent immediately. I selected course northeast because the enemy battlecruisers bore in that direction. Engage the enemy's rear would clarify that we meant the rear of that force, not the separated Blücher. The crucial exchange came when Colville asked, "Did you consider that these signals might be misinterpreted?" Seymour paused. The court recorder noted, "Extended silence, approximately 15 seconds. In the pressure of the moment, with shells falling and the ship flooding, I believed the context would make the meaning clear. The enemy's main force was escaping. Surely that was the priority everyone understood. But context is not visible through signal flags, is it, Commander?" "No, sir. It is not. Could you have signaled more clearly?" "Yes, sir. I could have signaled, 'Continue chase of enemy battlecruisers,' or negative Blücher, 'Continue pursuit.' These would have been unambiguous." "Why didn't you?" "Time pressure, sir. The Admiral needed immediate action. I used what seemed the fastest, clearest signals from the book, which were misinterpreted, which were interpreted differently than intended, sir." Captain Chatfield of Lion provided supporting context. "The bridge was chaos. We had taken multiple hits. Voice tubes were destroyed. The ship was listing and flooding. Lieutenant Commander Seymour had seconds to translate complex tactical intentions into simple flag signals. Perhaps someone could have done better, but Seymour was not incompetent. He was overwhelmed. The court also heard from the other captains. Captain Pelly of Tiger maintained that the signals clearly indicated Blücher. Captain Brock of Princess Royal agreed the signals, as received, admitted only one interpretation. Captain Halsey of New Zealand suggested that while he might have continued after the battlecruisers personally, Moore's interpretation was reasonable. The court's findings, delivered on February 7, satisfied no one. No courts-martial were recommended. Moore had acted correctly based on signals received. Seymour had performed his duties according to regulations. The failure was systemic rather than individual, a breakdown in communication, methods rather than personal incompetence. But the Navy acted through unofficial channels. Moore was quietly transferred to command of the Canary Station, technically a rear admiral's posting but effectively exile. He would never hold a seagoing combat command again. When Jutland was fought 16 months later, Moore was counting coal stocks in West Africa. Seymour's fate was more complex. Beatty retained him as flag lieutenant, either from loyalty or because replacing him would admit error, but Seymour was marked. Other officers treated him with careful courtesy but underlying distance. He remained with Beatty through Jutland, where similar signal failures would occur. In 1917, he was transferred to shore duty. He retired from the Navy in 1920, aged 37. On April 25, 1922, he took his own life at his home in Devon. He left no note. The Germans drew different lessons from Dogger Bank. Admiral Reinhard Scheer ordered immediate improvements based on Seydlitz's near destruction. Magazine protection was enhanced. Flash-tight doors were installed and rigorously maintained. Damage control procedures were revised. These changes would save German ships at Jutland, while British battlecruisers, which had not learned the same lessons, would explode from magazine detonations. Hipper was celebrated as a hero who had saved his squadron against superior forces. The Kaiser personally decorated him. But privately, Hipper knew how close they had come to disaster. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "We survived through British mistakes, not German superiority. Next time we may not be so fortunate." The British public never learned the full story. The Admiralty's version remained the official narrative, a victory with minor disappointments. The signal controversy was classified. Moore's effective exile was explained as reassignment for health reasons. Seymour's suicide was reported as death from natural causes. Within the fleet, Dogger Bank became a case study in what not to do. The Naval War College analyzed the battle repeatedly. Signal procedures were revised. New signals were added to the book. Continue engaging enemy main force. Disregard stragglers. Maintain pursuit of flying enemy. But the fundamental problem converting command intent into unambiguous tactical orders under combat stress remained unsolved. At Jutland on May 31, 1916, many of the same problems recurred. Evan Thomas's 5th Battle Squadron turned the wrong way due to signal confusion, losing 10 minutes in the pursuit. Jellicoe deployed the Grand Fleet on incomplete information due to communication failures. Multiple opportunities to destroy German forces were missed due to misunderstood or misinterpreted signals. The Dogger Bank signal failure was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a systemic problem. The Royal Navy of 1915 had the world's most powerful ships, best-trained crews, and strongest naval tradition. But it was trying to fight modern war with communication methods essentially unchanged since Trafalgar. Colored flags were being asked to convey complex tactical concepts at distances and speeds Nelson never imagined. In 1920, Admiral Jellicoe published The Grand Fleet, 1914-1916. In discussing Dogger Bank, he wrote, "The action demonstrated that our signal system, adequate for the measured evolutions of peacetime, was insufficient for the confusion of battle. Between what an admiral intends and what his fleet understands lies a gap that only perfect communication can bridge. At Dogger Bank, that gap measured 3 enemy battlecruisers.